Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is April Wepler, and I am the Engagement Coordinator at the Canadian Environmental Law Association, or CELA. Thank you for joining our webinar. This is the second in a series of 3 webinars looking at air quality issues in Aamjiwnaang First Nation. And in this session, we will be sharing information about what information about air emissions is available and how you can access it. So I'll start off with a land acknowledgement. I live in Guelph on the banks of the Speed River, on the traditional lands of Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples, and on treaty lands of Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and 6 nations of the Grand Watershed. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the Canadian Environmental Law Association. I think most of you were on our first webinar, and there's lots more about us on our website. And similarly, our next slide talks a bit about the Canadian Environmental Law Foundation. And there is also all of that information online, and you would have heard it in the first webinar. So let's move right on to the introductions. So this is, as I mentioned, a 3-part webinar series. And we had our first session on April 25th last week, talking about the health impacts of emissions from the surrounding industry in Aamjiwnaang. And we provided an overview of the regulatory framework that governs air quality in Ontario, including the permitting system for air emissions. So that recording is already posted on the website. You may have gotten it by email, but if not, it is on our website. And then today we already said we're going to talk about the air emissions and what information is available to the public and how you can access it. And then next week on May 9th, we'll talk about what tools are available to report your environmental concerns and why reporting is important. And this 3-part webinar series will be followed by an in-person session in Aamjiwnaang on May 30th. That in-person session is really intended for the community members in Aamjiwnaang, and we'll be opening up that registration to them in the next week or so. All right, before we get into the agenda, I just for a moment want to talk about who's on the line and do a little bit of housekeeping. So I'm joined today by my colleagues from CELA. We have Zoe St. Pierre, who is our articling student. We have Teresa McClenaghan, who will be presenting. Teresa's our executive director. And we also have Joe Castrilli and Jackie Wilson, who are lawyers with CELA. And then we'll also be getting a presentation from Faye De Leon, who is a researcher and paralegal with CELA, and she's traveling today, so she couldn't join us live, but she pre-recorded her presentation, so we'll see her slides. Then we also have a number of folks on the line from the planning team. We were invited by Matt Stone and Ember Chapdelaine and Jeff Plains to deliver these webinars for you. So Matt works with Legal Aid Ontario. Ember's an articling student for Legal Aid Ontario, and Jeff Plain works with the Community Legal Assistance Sarnia Clinic. In terms of housekeeping, you're all really familiar with Zoom webinar at this point. You're muted, your cameras are off, but we would welcome your questions in the Q&A box, and then we'll take those questions during discussion period after the presentations. We are recording today's session, and we'll post that recording as well as the slide deck on our website, so you'll have access to that information afterwards. So I'm going to pass it over to Teresa. And Teresa, maybe if you can start off with just talking a little bit about CELA's role and how we're hoping to help in Aamjiwnaang before you get into your slides.
Okay, thank you, April. Right, so CELA is an Ontario legal aid clinic and a national NGO. And as many of you will know, we do law reform and public legal education and representation. And so what we're hoping with this webinar series and with this outreach effort is to provide resources and tools for people to know more about air quality in the area, to get involved in influencing those decisions, and to help to start to make a difference about the way air is regulated in the area, and ultimately to improve air quality in the region. So that's the ultimate goal. And we strongly believe that people being able to engage in decision-making that affects their own environment is crucial as a matter of environmental justice and as a way to make the best decisions we can make. So today we'll be talking about right to know, about provincial and local resources, as well as federal, and a nod to the North American context as well. So I'm going to move on to the slides for today. So the first question is, just a moment, I'm just going to change my view here. Why does it matter to know about pollution in the area where you live? And of course, a fundamental context is that all of the air we all breathe and everything else around us that depends on air is breathing a common resource. And polluters, frankly, are imposing waste from their processes into the air and thus imposing it on everyone who is sharing that air. So air pollution permits, if we step back for a minute, they started, about 100 years ago as a way for the government to allow industrial activities to occur when otherwise it might have been stopped under Western law courts by the torts of public or private nuisance. And typically, most air pollution permits have not required polluters to pay for their permission other than some small permit application fees. And then there have been different standards about how much they can permit or whether they have to put different pieces of equipment into their facilities to control the pollution. More recently, some of the market instruments like carbon pricing that you would have heard about or cap and trade before that have been mechanisms to impose costs of pollution, at least for greenhouse gases, on polluters in Canada. But most air pollution, frankly, particularly toxics and the kind of thing we're talking about today, is still, quote, free to the polluter in this province and across the country. And so, in theory, the imposing of effects of air pollution on the surrounding community brings with it an obligation on the facility that's emitting that waste to provide information to the public about what is being emitted and what they therefore are being required to breathe and ingest. So we're talking today about the concept of right to know, and right to know is a type of soft law. The hope behind it is that informed public will engage in dialogue with polluting firms to reduce their pollution, and also the informed public will urge governments to mandatorily require reduced pollution from facilities. So what are the benefits of having good information about air pollution? They're pretty common sense, but it's worth listing them. One benefit is personal protection, and I'll have an example later in the slides about the Ontario air quality warnings about the air quality coming from many sources, and it may be useful for gauging outdoor activity, sports, lawn care, and so on. It's also important for informed occupational protection in your job. It's important to provide an information base to demand action for air pollution cleanup from the responsible parties. For example, the National Pollutant Release Inventory that Faye will discuss provides the address to write to the facility. It's also important to compare air quality in different regions to demand explanations, and we'll talk more about that next week, as well as to hold decision makers in government to account for the way air pollution is regulated. And we'll talk more about that next week as well. So there are various types of right to know systems in place in Ontario or that affect Ontario that go from local to international. And a local example that we don't have in the slides today is that Toronto passed a very innovative municipal bylaw called ChemTrack, which requires a host of facilities to report the emissions from their operations that aren't large enough to make the National Pollutant Release Inventory, but are still very important cumulatively in the local environment. And then that information is public. Similarly, regionally, there are many good examples like McMaster University and Hamilton Public Health have published good regional air quality studies. Clean Air Sarnia is attempting to do the same locally. And we'll have a slide from there. The Provincial Air Quality Monitoring Program and Ambient Air Quality Reporting we'll talk about today further. And similarly, the National Air Pollution Surveillance Program, and of course, the National Pollutant Release Inventory. And then I'll have a few examples of taking stock under the North American context. So we're going to turn it to Faye's video at this point, April. So I will turn it back to you to coordinate that.
Sure. So if you can stop screen sharing, Teresa, then Zoe will be able to. We'll get that video going.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Faye DeLeon. I'm a researcher and a paralegal at the Canadian Environmental Law Association, and I'll be talking a little bit about community right to know. Next slide. Just a little bit about toxic chemicals and the potential sources and potential impacts to health. In Canada, we have about 23,000 chemicals in the market, with another 500 to 600 chemicals being added every year as new substances. We deal with toxic chemicals basically through a life cycle approach. When I talk about it from a cradle to cradle approach, we think about it in the context of from the extraction to production to manufacturing, and ultimately disposal and possibly the processing of toxic chemicals. And generally, the approach when we think about regulating chemicals, we talk about it from a risk-based approach, but there's certainly the notion of taking looking at the hazards properties of chemicals as a way to think about managing chemicals. But generally, the regulatory framework focuses on a risk-based approach, which looks at both hazards and exposure information. And generally, the approach to trying for real protection of human health, a prevention strategy is often preferred, particularly because we want to see a reduction and a management of those or an ultimate elimination of the chemicals that we're most concerned about, as many of these chemicals are associated with specific health impacts and environmental impacts. And most notably, there are groups that are much more at higher risk, and I would just point to children, workers, Indigenous communities, women of childbearing years, racialized communities, and people of low income are much more prone or high risk to the impacts from exposure to toxic chemicals. Next slide, please. And I'm just demonstrating sources of exposure to human health that could actually happen. And as I mentioned, from extraction to the transport of chemicals certainly gives an opportunity for exposure to human health, mostly by inhalation and interaction via that route, and is mostly relevant for people in the workplaces, but certainly for the public in the surrounding areas also exposed to those chemicals. As we see from other industrial processes, refining and manufacture can also be a source of exposure to human health, and as well as the everyday products that we see around our house may also contain similar chemicals or other chemicals that are not mostly in the natural environment. And finally, as we refer to the issue around taking a life cycle approach and looking at cradle to cradle, waste management processes also pose exposure routes to human health. And as we know, environmental exposure comes from various routes that could impact farmlands and also be a source of exposure to human health, air, and the water that we rely on for our drinking water sources. Next slide, please. And so what I wanted to do was just demonstrate that the importance of getting information on pollutants that might be in our everyday products, also found in from industrial sources. One key inventory that we rely on in Canada, and it's called the Canadian National Pollutants Release Inventory. It is mandated, reporting under this program is mandated through the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. That's our main environmental health legislation that governs how we evaluate and manage chemicals, toxic chemicals. And the authority is based on a mandatory requirement under Section 48 of CEPA which means that companies that meet a certain reporting threshold that's prescribed in the MPRI are required to report. And if they fail to do so, could face fines and penalties for not providing the reporting of annually to the program. NPRI was basically established in 1992 with the first reporting year in 1993. So it's been in play now for 30 years. And the mandatory reporting requirements include releases to air, water, and land, on-site and off-site disposal, as well as off-site transfer for recycling and treatment and disposal. Next slide, please. So as a community right to know regime, MPRI program actually covers over 300 pollutants. And in 2021, we saw 8,200 facilities reporting under the MPRI. Some of the pollutants that we are required for reporting include carcinogens, reproductive and developmental substances, endocrine disrupting chemicals, what we call criteria air contaminants, and chemicals that are deemed to be toxic under our legislation, the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. The type of facilities that the MPRI program actually covers includes companies that are involved, or facilities that are involved in manufacturing a variety of goods, mines, oil and gas operations, power plants, as well as sewage treatment plants. The exclusions could include, and does include, practices that involve education and training of students, research and testing, those institutes that conduct those types of activities, and practices like dentistry are not included in MPRI reporting. And MPRI does provide information around information as it relates to the risk to the environment and health. The next slide, please. What do communities do with the information that's available through the MPRI data? A number of things, including understanding the possible threats to their health and environment, looking at specific pollution data for a facility that's in their community so they can actually reach out to them, and as well as understand better what kind of releases are in their community. You can look at pollution data for all facilities reporting under MPRI using postal code searches. So it gives you a list of those facilities that would be in the vicinity of your community. And you can also look for data on a particular pollutant. So next slide, please. This is just a graphics to demonstrate where the reporting happens. So anything, any pollutants that are covered under MPRI would look at the off-site releases to air, water, and land, and it demonstrates to you the various routes by which those measurements could be taken by the facility. It also provides on-site disposal, which means any releases via landfills or spills and or underground injection gets covered under the on-site disposal on the property of the facility. And you have also off-site transfer for disposal and treatment. So that means it's going off to another plant for further processing or treatment. And then you have some facilities that require for off-site transfer for recycling. So they're treated for the purposes of being reused. So next slide, please. So this is just an example of the distribution of facilities, the 8,200 facilities that reported in 2001, and the distribution across Canada. I had wanted to include an enlarged version of the Sarnia area, but it was quite difficult. So we will do that for the next graphics that we present to this group. Next slide, please. What I wanted to do was just present hone down into the Sarnia area and present the companies that reported in 2021 for a specific postal code. And so these are the facilities that are reporting to MPRI in 2021, which you could see are kind of the range of types of facilities are pretty broad. That includes oil refinery or petroleum refinery, and as well as pipelines, and the city of Sarnia for the wastewater treatment plants are also included in this. So for 2021, there are a distinct, I believe it's 20, I've got lost the number, 22 distinct facilities or companies that report. Some of them have multiple plants and facilities, so that you will see individual plant reports for those facilities. Next slide, please. And what I wanted to do was just share the types of data that was available through the MPRI. And in this case, what I've ended up doing was looking at petroleum sector, but as it relates to the issue around plastic manufacturing, plastic production, and some of the key pollutants that were identified as relevant for that kind of process include benzene, benzoapyrene, ethylene, lead in its compounds, methanol, toluene, xylene, and then I added sulfur dioxides because I think there's a real interest in that. And what we've seen for air releases between 2016 and 2021 is that generally these types of pollutants are actually going down, but oddly enough, chemicals, pollutants like benzene and sulfur dioxides are actually increasing in numbers between that same range of time period, 2016 to 2021. Benzene has increased about 1% during that time period. Not large, but significant enough to demonstrate that, we don't have a good handle on these chemicals from an air release perspective. Sulfur dioxide, much, much more. We saw an over 400,000 increase, 400,000 kilograms increase of air releases of sulfur dioxides during that time period, which represents about 27% increase. So if I go on to the next slide, I want to demonstrate what I did with this data, which is I've actually combined air releases with water and land releases plus on-site disposal for these chemicals. And the reason why I wanted to demonstrate and share this information was to just show an example of why it's actually quite beneficial to look at these chemicals beyond air releases, that it may be showing something different. So in the case of these chemicals that we've selected, 8 of them, what I included here was to demonstrate those chemicals that actually showed an increase over the same period of time, taking into account the other releases to air, to water and land, and on-site disposal. And so we saw an increase in benzene, not much, but approximately about 2%. For benzoapyrene, which is a PAH, polyaromatic hydrocarbon, that number jumped to about 19% increase over that same time period. Lead jumped over 1,700% during that time period, mostly because of the disposal on site. So that's something to just keep in mind in terms of looking at these pollutants. And the other one that I just want to highlight is the sulfur dioxide number, which estimated to be about 24% increase during that time period. So if I wanted to conclude information around the National Pollutants Release Inventory and how it could probably help community determine what information might be available and useful for supporting dialogue around facility performances on these chemicals, I would say that looking at trends over time is helpful, and looking not only at air releases, but looking at other releases as it pertains to the chemicals that might be staying on site and potentially could be a source of exposure to the community. So last slide, please, which is the last concluding comments that I have. So that's it for me. Thank you.
Okay, I just about said thank you to Faye because it seems like she's on the call with us. That video worked out well. So if you want to put your deck back up, Teresa.
Yeah, that was great. Okay, now I have to find out where I was, I guess. Hang on. Oh, there we go. Isn't that great? The magic of technology. So in addition to the National Pollutant Release Inventory, there also is the National Air Pollution Surveillance Program, and we've provided the link there. And this works in conjunction with the provinces, and there are monitoring stations across the country, and I'm going to demonstrate how you can find out about those locally. And as indicated, they, among other things, show trends and air quality impacts. So they have in their big picture reporting, they talk about general trends across a number of substances over about 37, almost 40 years, being gradually down. But as we'll see when we look at benzene, for example, which is the example I started last week and will continue this week, we'll see that for industrial facilities, it's actually holding steady in the Sarnia area, and the reductions are coming from other sources, which is important to pay attention to. But I think it's quite significant that we understand the sources. I have some slides from CAREX, which is a great resource, and this is a multi-institutional organization of university researchers and other experts who provide access to credible data and analysis and interactive tools like maps, summaries, and information about occupational exposures and environmental exposures. And so if we go there to talk more about benzene, for example, this is one example of the profiles they have. They have profiles around many other carcinogens, but this is an example showing you the description of the benzene profile as a carcinogen. And the routes of exposures, particularly skin contact and inhalation, are important. And then you can also look at their eWork resource, which is really fantastic. And it shows some of the types of exposure and what the implications are from that in terms of how many people are exposed to that type of workplace exposure. And so, for example, it does include a tab on benzene. And so, and then when you find out more about resources which they provide to help reduce exposure, which I think is extremely useful that they have, they give some good resources here from Alberta and Canada. And I should note that particularly they're talking about in these resources, various approaches, personal protective equipment, substitution in the processes themselves using different chemicals, engineering controls, administrative controls around quantities, and then similarly in the oil and gas industry, how to assess risks, how to reduce exposure, and responsibilities across the whole workplace. So then turning to the province, which, and these monitors are also part of that national pollution surveillance system that I mentioned, I'm going to spend a couple of minutes just doing a kind of a how-to about how you can find out more information about the reporting in your particular area. And of course, we'll use Sarnia as the example. So the website to get to the site is here, and I just drilled down into the Great Lakes region, and then you can drill down further into Southern Ontario, Southwest Ontario, and then you can click on the map where Sarnia is located, and that will take you into a place where you can choose to see the overview report for the particular day you're looking. This was yesterday, May 1st, so it showed you that yesterday the system was reporting overall low risk air quality in a number of different cities, including Sarnia. After you look at your city for the day you're interested in, often you want to look at the day you're talking about, the actual day you're existing in, but you can also look back, as I'll show you in a moment. But this is the color code showing you the different levels of risk, and particular note for people with certain medical conditions involving heart and breathing. And of course, you can get the forecast from Environment Canada And then you can read the guidance based on the level of risk that was flagged. And so this is very useful. Again, this is about general air quality at that monitor coming from all sources for the parameters they're measuring, which we'll see in a moment. And so if they're talking about low, which we saw there, then no worries for your usual outdoor activities. And then as the ratings increase, you would reduce the strenuousness of your outdoor activity and otherwise modify activity, particularly if you're experiencing symptoms or if you're vulnerable for a variety of reasons. And then you can go further down into the particular station. So this is the Sarnia Air Quality Monitoring Station, and we saw data last week from this one in a chart form, but this shows you a little picture of the monitoring station. And as you heard, it's at the Ontario Service Ontario site on Christina Street. And then for the particular day, I think this was also yesterday, if I recall correctly. So it showed you what they were measuring at the Sarnia station for the pollutants listed there, as well as the 1 hour ambient air quality criteria measured at that site. Now you can see here that these pollutants are some of the important air pollutants that contribute to smog and respiratory distress. And those are the ones that are showing here. And then you also can go back in time, as I mentioned, so you can select your station. You'll see that I chose to go back to January 1st last year, and then I just excerpted the end of the year to display that you can see what it was on those various dates. But if you actually were on the screen where I did this, you would have the whole year available, and you could look at the trends for the whole year. And then there are annual reports as well. The last one available is 2020, and you can drill down into the specific monitoring stations for those, and that's where some of the ambient air quality criteria for volatile organic chemicals are included for the ones they measure, like benzene. So we saw this last week, the benzene 2019 statistics, and showing you the number of samples at Sarnia was 57, and then the mean across the year at that Christina Street station was 0.419 micrograms per cubic meter. And last week's webinar talked about comparison to the ambient air quality criteria, as well as some of the health effects, so I'm not getting into that today. And as well, you can look at the 10-year trend from the 2020 report, and it's very similar. The other thing I wanted to do is mention that in Southwest Ontario, and I join you in living in Southwest Ontario, a little further up in the direction of those arrows. I'm in the Grand River watershed, but we all have a huge influence from US air quality, a variety of plants, but a lot of it is electricity generation, and quite a lot of it is coal still. And so those are producing nitrous oxide emissions and other pollutants, including generally benzene and mercury are among the pollutants in coal. That's not what this map is measuring, of course, but just to be aware, there are a variety of toxics in addition to the respiratory toxicants. And the general airflow, of course, comes from the southwest toward the northeast, and it's coming right through the corridor formed through the Great Lakes lowlands. And that's why we can really be impacted in Southwest Ontario by air quality on days like around Easter this year, where it was very hot and the air was just sitting still with high air quality warnings in our region. Traffic is also a very important source. I've just excerpted Public Health Ontario's fact sheet on air pollution and some things you can do personally, and also what are some of the broader issues. And so when I talked last week about some of the reductions in the Sarnia area over that 10-year trend that we saw a moment ago is coming actually from reductions in fuels and in the transportation sector, the facilities are kind of flatlined, as I mentioned, in terms of their emissions of those volatile organic compounds. But it's still important for overall health, of course, that we would have reduced exposure to these substances from other sources like traffic, because it's all cumulative. And then there's an important local initiative, the Clean Air Sarnia and Area Community Monitoring Program. I noticed that the website is a little bit stale dated, but that there is a note that there should be another public meeting happening in early 2023. I didn't see an exact date for that, but here are some of the participants supporting that effort. And here's a map. I just went back, I think, to an April date to pull this up and just do a screen share of the contaminants that were being measured through that monitoring network. So that's another important source of local information that's very unique to Sarnia. And then I mentioned that I would also look at the bigger picture across North America. And with introduction of the North American Free Trade Agreement back in the 1990s, there was an agreement to set up the three-country Commission for Environmental Cooperation. And all three countries have reporting systems kind of like our National Pollutant Release Inventory. They have different names in the US and Mexico. And then Taking Stock is a report that's released to give us a picture of the overall picture across the continent, and also to allow us to compare pollutants by sector, by industry, by state or province, the top polluters, and it's very, very easy to use and very useful. So if we look there, they have a map similar to the one Faye shared from the National Pollutant Release Inventory. This is the Taking Stock map of all of North America's reporting facilities here. And then you can go into the website, which I've provided the link for here. You can look at comparisons and trends and continental trends for a substance. So for example, here, I did take a look at benzene, and you can see that among the big users, as we know, are oil and gas extraction, as well as petroleum and coal products manufacturing, the distributors, somewhat more moderate emissions from pipelines, and so on. So what can you do with this kind of information? We've given you a few different systems, from local to regional to provincial, national, and international. If you start to spend any time on these websites and follow the information and start to learn about what's happening to the air pollution in your community or in the broader community of which you are a part, what can you do? So you could start to learn more about the sources of air pollution that are affecting your own community. You can join organizations working on reducing air pollution. You can write to the local elected officials. By local, I mean at all stages of government, but elected locally, from municipal, provincial, federal, band councils, and so on. You can send letters to the editor, and you can comment on proposals for new air approvals or otherwise participate in the air regulation system. And again, as I mentioned, we'll have more information on that in our next webinar. And with that, we'll put up our contact information, and I'll turn it back to April for moderating any Q&A we might have received.
Great. Thanks very much, Teresa. Okay, so that concludes the presentation portion of the webinar. So at this moment, I'm going to stop the recording, and then we're going to move into some discussion.